Bharata first. Well, I'm here to talk about an interesting and a very important subject. Away from public glare, New Delhi held its first political dialogue with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in Brussels. And this happened on December 12th, 2019. NATO is a political and military alliance of 28 European countries and two countries in North America, that is the United States and Canada. Attended by senior officials, including from the Ministry of External Affairs and the Ministry of Defense, it is learned that the idea was to ensure that the dialogue was primarily political in character and to avoid making any commitment on military or other bilateral cooperation. Last Friday, the Ministry of External Affairs said India has been in touch with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for quite some time now. Now, in this edition of Discourse, we will analyze the significance of India-NATO ties. Joining me on the program today are Gurjit Singh, author and former ambassador to Germany, ASEAN, and the African Union, and Swaran Singh, visiting professor, University of British Columbia, and professor of international relations, JNU. Thank you to my guests for joining me on this edition of the Discourse. Ambassador, let me start the program with you first. Let's first try and understand and analyze, where this news is coming from all of a sudden, because the newspapers are suddenly talking about it. They are all, this meeting happened quite some time back, and suddenly this issue seems to be in the news. What do you make of this?
Essentially, this comes back to the news due to the contention between the NATO led by the US and Russia, which has become more cantankerous right now, and the US-China rivalry. But I think to understand where we stand, we need to go back. And when NATO was set up in 1949, it was when India had a non-aligned policy and we opposed military pacts, whether it was NATO, CETO, CENTO, or the Warsaw Pact. So our policy of non-alignment was always opposed to such military entities. However, after a while, the non-aligned policy goes into a non-aligned movement. So today, we are essentially looking at strategic autonomy. Now, the strategic autonomy is not the same as non-alignment, because there is no movement to rely on. I think that is one essential difference we need. The second aspect is the world has changed a lot. In the past, let's say the last 2 or 3 decades, NATO was less focused on Russia, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and started looking at Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, India was in touch with NATO to discuss these. Ultimately, Iraq was not a NATO operation, and India did not participate. But Afghanistan was a NATO operation, which India was in touch on humanitarian side, not on military side. So, in today's context, where the cleavage between the Russians have come out, putting us in a bit of a jam, because when your best friends fight, you are always in a jam. But when your enemies and your friends fight, like China and Russia, you are also in a jam. Now, the Americans are trying to bring NATO. As you know, the Quad is not NATO. But our other two Quad partners are now NATO plus partners. India is not. So India is in Quad but not in AUKUS. So India has consistently taken a view that we will remain geopolitically aligned. We will discuss defense matters, but there will be no common military strategy. Now, this is where we stand. So at the I think in June, the summit, the Americans not only led to the admission of Finland and Sweden, but also invited their allies from Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, to come there. But India did not go because we remain, as you said, clear, we would be politically engaged but not be a part of the defense engagement. And the NATO Secretary General was here this year for the Rausan dialogue 2 months ago. So it is the openness of the dialogue is there. I would link it to our strategic autonomy.
Absolutely. All right, Professor, let me bring you in now. So, what is the significance of these talks? How do you look at it?
I think, Frank, it is important not to look this news about India and NATO being in conversation in isolation. They have to be looked upon in a certain context. For example, you notice that India is in middle of Ukraine crisis, sending troops for joint exercises along with China to Russia in October. Or India also at the same time holds exercises like Milan and Malabar, where Australia, Japan, United States, India exercise together. So it's an overall transformation of India from being once upon a time a least developed and developing country and then non-aligned nation to now being seen as an emerging power. And therefore, its alignments over period of time will have to be transformed and are already transforming in that sense. You notice the new assertive tone of India's foreign policy very clearly, and as well in operative terms, engagement with several other important groupings around the world, including NATO in that sense. As Ambassador Singh just mentioned, India has been in certain amount of coordination with NATO, whether it is anti-piracy operations, for example, in Gulf of Aden, or the long-drawn investments that India had in Afghanistan when NATO was in control of Afghanistan, more or less. So to some extent, certain coordination has been taking place. And the news about this 2019 December 12 dialogue has come into little focus, partly because of certain events that happened in July or June this year. For example, June this year, as part of NATO's out of area operations for last 20 years, but now increasing focus on Indo-Pacific. Individually, all of these nations have issued their Indo-Pacific strategies, but NATO also now needs to gear up and address challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. And therefore, in June summit, for example, they invited prime ministers of Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and president of South Korea to join their summit in Madrid. And in July, we saw again there was an important amendment made in US Congress on their National Defense Authorization Act, which would deepen India and United States ties. And one Indian origin Democrat congressman, Rao Khanna, has been one who has been pushing this closer cooperation. And he gave series of interviews in July saying that India should become part of NATO plus, because that will be really in order of things how India and United States are building their proximity and defense cooperation together. And that kind of a status would facilitate the transfer of technology, defense deals, and so on. So that has made, I think, a certain context in which India's continuous staying on course with its proactive neutrality and not denouncing Russia in middle of Ukraine crisis, now almost reaching 6 months, is where this kind of issue has intentionally, unintentionally been brought into focus. But I think it is in order, because Government of India, when pushed to the shove, push came to shove, they have clarified it's only a political dialogue and it involves no military commitment as of now. And I'm reminded of the Raisina dialogue of April last year, when for the first time in NATO official, Secretary General Stoltenberg was invited, and I'm quoting him. He said that it is time that India and NATO share a lot of challenges together. And he mentioned, quote unquote, need to consult, coordinate, and take concerted action. Now, that could be interpreted in terms of both political and military components to it. But Government of India, Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson, has clarified that there is no military commitment at this stage, only political conversation, not even coordination, is how he mentioned it. So I think that is where India has to stay clear and cautious of not compromising with the strategic autonomy, which is the central axis of India's foreign policy, and otherwise begin to coordinate with all groups. For example, we are friendly to Iran and Israel and Saudi Arabia at the same time today, which is a reflection of India's new stature, India's new focus, India's new orientation in foreign policy. So if you look at this conversation as part of the larger change in India's foreign policy, you will find it is not too much discordant note in how India has been evolving in terms of its engagements with multiple groupings around the world.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's time now to get some questions in from our viewers who watch our programs regularly. Let me take a question by Ramya Singh forward and bring in a new element and a new aspect as well. Ambassador, I'd like to take this up with you. Ramya Singh asks, what will be the position of NATO regarding regional security concerns of India, considering past relationships that it has had with, with Pakistan and Afghanistan, especially the US's relationship with Pakistan and Afghanistan? This is what Ramya Singh is asking.
I think it's a very valid question. So the first thing, I think, when we look at strategic autonomy and building on what Professor Swaran said, NATO wants to consult, but when it comes to, let's say, Afghanistan, they packed up and left without much consultation with us. And it was putting our security in jeopardy. Secondly, Pakistan has been associated with NATO from 1949 on. And that relationship has not diminished. It is perhaps wavering in importance. So that problem will remain with us. Associated with that problem is that today NATO is being revived as an anti-Russian front, whereas we want more cohesive action against China. So there is a difference in objectives. I think what we also need to understand is that India was initially classified a non-NATO ally after the civilian nuclear agreement was signed, basically to facilitate certain defense sales to India and hopefully wean us away from dependence on Russian arms. Now, that non-NATO ally status is today sought to be converted into a NATO plus status, which is where we are becoming a bit cautious. But what we need to understand, it is many aspects of US domestic and foreign policy, like Pakistan, Afghanistan, or the sanctions they put like CAATSA, which then they may find a way to get you out of. So these are nothing to do with what India has done. Americans are doing this, putting them into conversions and then trying to untie the knots. So I think we need to be very clear. Let them resolve their problems, but we have to rise above Pakistan, engage with NATO for wider regional and global outcomes.
Absolutely. Let me take in one more question now and then take the discussion forward. Professor, this one's for you. Let me share my screen. Look for the next question as well. Hold on, just pulling that up at the moment. The next question is from Pratyush. Pratyush is asking, how would the developing relationship of India with NATO affect the close ties that India has with Russia? That's his question.
Thank you to Pratyush, but also compliments to Frank. You have a very large number of viewers, I understand. So it's good to involve viewers into these discussions and make sure that they have some takeaway from our discussions. I'm happy to answer this question. I think India has made sure that India's relationship, which is time-tested with Russia, doesn't get compromised. And in fact, that has been the fundamental challenge of last 6 months of India explaining why it is continuing to engage with Russia, whether it is in terms of procuring oil and fertilizers and other commodities. And to some extent, I think the Western powers have begun to understand that India would stand on its own and follow its own national interests. So I don't see so far any indication of India giving any impression that India is under pressure and therefore India is distancing itself from Russia. Now, let me also give the other aspect of the same dilemma that India has. Other aspect of the same dilemma is that India perhaps cannot afford to sort of ditch and give up cooperation with Russia. And because that will be very counterproductive for India, because what will happen is that if India stops engaging Russia under pressure from United States and its allies, Russia will be willy-nilly drawn together to China, which is not good for India's national security. So India, because of its compulsions as well, not just for its principles, has to continuously engage Russia and of course engage NATO at the same time, because the last question that was asked was about regional security, and we understand that NATO is increasingly focusing on Indo-Pacific. China is repeatedly emerging as a challenge in NATO deliberations, and that is how they are co-opting many of the Asian partners into NATO. And China, of course, is India's main concern. So if there are groupings whose interests overlap with India's, it makes sense to sort of build that kind of coordination with those groupings like NATO. But yes, no compromise on India's relations with Russia so far. India has refused, despite all the pressures, to denounce Russia's so-called special military operations in Ukraine. So I think there is a so far very, very complex but very, very concerted effort to ensure that balance in the relationship, where India continuously also coordinates with Russia and even China, but at the same time has emerged as a major defense partner, as non-NATO ally, as Ambassador said, of United States. So in that sense, it's a happy situation of all major powers willing to engage India, which is a reflection of India's rising stature.
Absolutely. All right, time to get closing comments now from both the panelists with the best way forward and what next, where do we go from here? Ambassador.
Well, I think I agree with Professor Swaran. So, only point I diverge is I don't think the challenge of NATO to China is so great. It only expanded from 2 paras to 6 paras in their annual summit. But essentially, I think with China, we are largely on our own. And we need Russian weaponry and American help and intelligence as and when the time comes. So nobody is going to come to your aid except on coordinated action on the ocean. The land border, I don't see how NATO or anybody else is of much use except in periphery. I think we should take forward the engagement with NATO like we do with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, as Professor mentioned, we are actually taking part in exercises with Russia, China, Pakistan, everybody. So there should be no abhorrence that Pakistan is associated with NATO. After all, we overcame this when we recently joined the Combined Joint Task Force Against Terrorism based in Bahrain. I think it's called Joint JTA 140, which for years we did join because it had Pakistan in it. So we are overcoming those Pakistani hesitancies and playing our regional. Finally, what I would like to say is that NATO has about 1,400 activities which are non-military, which are peace-related activities, over 40 sectors. So there is much that we can do. This is how Finland and Sweden were actually associated with NATO for years without being formal NATO members. In fact, they went beyond. So now when they have to become NATO members, their coordination actually is very close. So I think India could start working on some of these peace-led initiatives which NATO provides.
Absolutely. And Professor, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Thank you, Frank, for this discussion today. I think we have to realize that NATO is no longer the NATO that we had when India had celebrated its non-alignment as its policy. NATO then was a limited alliance of about 12 countries. It has expanded now to 30 countries. Indeed, it has about dozen plus other strategic partners, dialogue partners, and so on. And if you include every country that cooperates with NATO, the number goes up to 60. And in our own immediate region, in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, most of the close allies of United States, Israel, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and they're all increasingly joining and working together with NATO, which is expanding and becoming a much larger organization than it was before. And in its out-of-area operations, it does a lot more things than simply fighting wars. So in that sense, the nature of the animal that we are discussing, NATO itself has changed over a period of time. Second important point, both China and Pakistan have been in close coordination and dialogue with NATO. And I understand that NATO's the focus over a period of time, because of United States continuous technology, trade, Taiwan-related irritations with China, NATO's focus on China has transformed over a period of time. And therefore, I think overall it comes closer to what is seen as India's national security challenges or national interests. And therefore, it is perfectly in order, with complete caution of saving our strategic autonomy. It is in order to begin to have certain kind of conversation. I, for not a second, will believe that India depends on its national security on NATO, America, or anybody else. India, at the highest level of Prime Minister, has clarified it several times. Whenever efforts or offers of mediations are made, whether it is in India-Pakistan relations or India-China relations, India has said repeatedly, India is fully capable of dealing with either China or Pakistan on its own. But there is no harm in coordinating with such larger and very important groupings like NATO, because India's role is no longer limited only to its own national defense. India now plays an important role as net security provider in the larger region and has an influence around the world in various other forums and initiatives where I think influential groupings like NATO will begin to seek, and I think India should offer certain amount of coordination as long as India's national interest is not compromised.
Absolutely. That's the bottom line. At the end of the day, India's national interest should not be compromised. We should always look out for the best as far as our country is concerned. Gentlemen, pleasure having you on the program. Thank you so much for joining me on the discourse and putting things into perspective for us. Professor and Ambassador, thank you. And that's it on this edition of Discourse. See you again